Daniel walked through the long hall of the royal palace, his boots echoing against the polished floor. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that came before storms. He had returned from the battlefield only a few days ago, carrying both scars and memories of soldiers who would never return. He was a fighter, known for his courage, but tonight he was only a man with questions in his heart. The queen was sick, and no one seemed to know how much time she had left. Queen Eleanor had ruled for many years with kindness and strength. The people loved her, and her voice had always been enough to bring calm even in the darkest days. But now her light was fading. Daniel had seen her earlier that day, lying weak on her bed, her face pale, her breath short. It had shaken him more than any enemy blade ever could. The woman who had been the heart of the kingdom was slipping away, and no one could stop it. The palace felt different since her illness grew worse. Advisors whispered in corners, their eyes darting around as if they feared being overheard. Guards stood stiff, watching everyone with suspicion. Servants walked quickly, carrying food and medicine, but never smiling. It was as though the life of the whole palace was tied to the queen's health. And as she weakened, the palace itself began to break apart. Daniel stopped near a tall window and looked outside. The capital city stretched far into the distance, filled with lights from houses, markets, and towers. He knew the people out there did not yet understand how close they were to losing everything. If the queen died, the unity of the kingdom would die with her. Enemies at the borders would rise, old rivalries between noble families would return, and war would come not only from outside but from within. He thought of the soldiers who had fought under his command. They had believed in the queen. They had believed that every sacrifice they made meant a safer tomorrow for their families. What would happen to those sacrifices if the kingdom fell into chaos now? The thought burned inside him. He could not let her die. Not like this. Not when so much depended on her. As Daniel walked deeper into the palace, he passed two men talking in low voices. They did not notice him at first. He caught only a few words, but they made his stomach twist. They spoke of the queen's sickness as if it was an opportunity. They spoke of power, of who might rise next, of who could control the throne if Eleanor did not live. Daniel's hand tightened into a fist. He stepped forward, and the men fell silent when they saw him. They bowed quickly and moved away, but Daniel's heart was already heavy with doubt. Da-da-da-da-da-da. It was not only enemies outside the kingdom he had to fear. There were enemies inside these very walls. Later that night, Daniel sat in his small chamber. The room was simple compared to the grand halls of the palace. He had never cared for gold or riches. All he had ever wanted was to serve his people, to fight for their safety. But tonight he felt a new weight pressing down on him. Protecting the queen was not just about guarding her from blades or bullets. It was about protecting her from lies, from betrayal, from the greed that was already spreading in the hearts of those who claimed to serve her. He closed his eyes and thought of Queen Eleanor again, remembered her voice when she had spoken to him after his last battle. She had thanked him not as a ruler to a soldier, but as one human to another. She had placed her hand on his shoulder and said, he carried the spirit of the kingdom within him. That memory lit a fire in him now. If she was on the verge of death, then he would stand by her side until her last breath. And if there was any chance to save her, he would find it, no matter the cost. Outside his window, the night sky was dark, filled with stars that seemed distant and cold. Daniel stared at them for a long time. He knew storms were coming. He knew enemies would move soon. But he also knew something else. He would not let his queen fall, not while he still had strength in his body and breath in his lungs. For her, for his people, he was ready to risk everything. Daniel rose early the next morning, long before the sun lifted above the city. He had slept little, for his mind was restless. He kept seeing the queen's face in his thoughts, pale and weak, and hearing the whispers of men who spoke of her sickness, as if it was their chance to gain power. His heart would not let him rest. He knew that something was wrong, something more than illness. The palace was quiet at that hour. Servants moved softly through the halls, carrying trays of food and medicine. Guards stood with tired eyes, their armor catching the faint light of lanterns. Daniel walked among them, unnoticed by most, his mind heavy with questions. He wondered who he could trust. Some soldiers had served faithfully for years, but others might be swayed by promises of wealth and rank. In times like these, Loyalty was as fragile as glass. He entered the queen's chamber. The air smelled of herbs and smoke from the lamps burning near her bed. Queen Eleanor lay resting, her breathing shallow. A young woman named Clara sat beside her, holding a bowl of water with a cloth. She was one of the queen's closest attendants, gentle and careful, and Daniel had seen her often by the queen's side. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with worry. "She grows weaker," Clara whispered. "Medicines do little now." Daniel stepped closer to the bed. He looked at Eleanor, her hands resting on the blanket, her skin pale against the white fabric. For a moment, he felt a deep fear rise in him. He had faced battles where death circled all around him, yet this sight struck him harder than any fight. He reached down and lightly touched her hand. "You must hold on," he said softly, though he knew she could not hear him. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I fear they will let her die. Some speak of choosing a new ruler. They say the kingdom needs strength, not a sick queen." Daniel turned sharply. "Who says this?" Clara shook her head. "I only hear whispers. I do not know who begins them. But the voices grow louder each day." Daniel felt anger burning in his chest. To speak of replacing her while she still lived was treachery. Beloved. The chamber with his jaw tight and his thoughts darker than before. If the queen's sickness was natural, then hope was small enough. But if someone wished her dead, if poison or betrayal had taken root here, then it was his duty to find the truth. As the day went on, he walked through the palace, listening more closely. He heard men speak in shadows, their words hidden, but the tone was clear. Fear and greed had entered these walls. Some wanted the throne for themselves, while others feared the enemies outside the kingdom and believed a stronger hand was needed. Daniel's steps grew heavy. It was no longer just illness that threatened Eleanor. It was betrayal from within. That evening he sat in the courtyard watching soldiers train with their weapons. The clash of steel echoed through the air, but his thoughts wandered. He remembered the battles he had fought, the friends he had lost, and the promises they had made to protect their people. Those promises were now his alone to carry. He felt the weight of them pressing harder with each breath. Clara came to him quietly. She had followed after finishing her duties. She sat beside him, her face pale with worry. "You care for her more than most," she said. Daniel nodded. "She is the heart of the kingdom. If she falls, we all fall." Clara hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I have seen strange things. Medicines changed at the last moment. Servants I do not recognize carrying trays into her chamber. I fear someone works against her." Daniel looked at her sharply. This confirmed what he already feared. "Then I will watch them. If they seek her death, they will face me first." The night came slowly, the sky turning black with stars scattered like dust. Daniel stood alone near the queen's chamber, his sword at his side, his eyes fixed on every shadow. He knew the days ahead would test him more than any battlefield. He was no longer only a fighter for his people. He was now the shield of the queen herself. And he swore to himself, as the cold night settled over the palace, that he would not fail her, no matter the cost. Daniel stayed close to the queen's chamber as the days passed. He watched every servant, every guard, every tray of food and medicine that entered the room. He slept little, and when he did close his eyes, it was only for a short time before he forced himself awake again. His body was tired, but his heart stayed strong. He knew danger was near. One evening as the lamps burned low, he noticed a young man carrying a tray into the queen's room. Daniel had never seen his face before. The boy moved quickly, his eyes lowered as if to avoid attention. Daniel stepped forward and blocked the door. "Who are you?" Daniel asked firmly. The boy stammered, his hands shaking as he held the tray. I was sent from the kitchens. They said the queen needed this drink." Daniel looked at the cup on the tray. The liquid inside was dark, with a bitter smell that made his chest tighten. He had seen enough poisons on battlefields to know the scent. He grabbed the boy's wrist before he could move. "Who sent you?" Daniel demanded. The boy's face went pale, shook his head, refusing to answer. Daniel called for the guards and the boy was taken away. Clara came running when she heard the noise. She looked at the cup, her face full of fear. "They are trying to kill her," she whispered. Daniel nodded grimly. And they will try again. From that moment, Daniel knew that the queen's sickness was not natural. Someone within the palace wanted her gone, and they would stop at nothing. He felt his anger rising, but he forced himself to stay calm. Anger would not protect the queen, so only careful steps and clear eyes would. The next day, Daniel went to speak with some of the older guards, men he had fought beside in years past. He trusted them more than anyone else in the palace, told them of the poisoned drink, and warned them to watch closely. They swore loyalty to him and to the queen, gave Daniel hope that not all hearts had turned to greed. That night, he returned to the courtyard. The stars were bright above him, but his mind was restless. Clara found him again, her hands trembling as she held a small folded cloth. Inside was a small piece of paper, taken from the pocket of the boy who had brought the poisoned drink. Daniel read the words, his eyes narrowing. It was a message written in quick, sharp strokes. It spoke of a plan of a gathering in the western hall of the palace, and of the queen's death as the final step before new rulers could rise. Daniel clenched the paper in his fist. The traitors had shown their hand. He would not allow them to finish their plan. When the hour came, Daniel moved through the palace like a shadow. He knew the halls well, every turn and every hidden passage. He reached the western hall and listened at the door. Outside, voices spoke in low tones, but he could make out enough to know the truth. "The queen will not last long," one voice said. "When she is gone, the people will look for strong hands to guide them." Another voice replied, colder, "If she does not die soon, we will see to it ourselves. The kingdom cannot wait." Daniel's blood burned, but he waited, his hand on the hilt of his sword, counted the voices, knowing who he would face when the time came. These were not strangers. They were men who had once stood before the queen and bowed. They were supposed to serve her, yet they plotted her end. When the meeting ended, Daniel stepped back into the shadows and let them pass. Could not strike then, not alone. But now he knew who they were. He knew the faces of betrayal. He returned to Clara and the trusted guards, telling them all he had heard. They listened with anger and fear, but also with resolve. Together, they began to prepare. The queen was weak, but she was still alive, and as long as she lived, hope still burned. Daniel looked at her sleeping form that night, her breath shallow but steady. He swore silently to her that he would not let the traitors succeed. If they came for her again, they would face him first. He was only one fighter, but he carried the strength of 1,000 hearts that still believed in her. And he would risk everything, even his life, to keep her safe. The palace shook with unrest. News spread through the halls that the queen's strength had faded even more. Servants whispered in fear, guards looked at one another with doubt, and advisors spoke in hurried voices behind closed doors. Daniel could feel the tension rising like a storm. The traitors were ready to make their move. He walked through the corridors, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Every step he took was heavy, but his eyes were sharp. He had seen war many times, but this was different. This was not an enemy outside the walls. This was an enemy dressed in fine robes, smiling while planning betrayal. He could not let them succeed. Clara stayed close to the queen's chamber, never leaving her side. She cared for the queen with all her heart, wiping her forehead, helping her drink water, on whispering gentle words, even though the queen was too weak to respond. Daniel often stood near the doorway, watching over them both. He found strength in Clara's courage. She was no soldier, yet she was as brave as any fighter he had known. Late one night, when most of the palace was silent, Daniel heard the sound of footsteps outside the queen's room. He moved quickly into the hallway and saw shadows moving toward the door. He stepped into the light of the lantern, his sword drawn. 4 men stopped in their tracks. They were dressed as guards, but Daniel knew their faces. They were among those he had heard in the Western Hall. "Should not be here," Daniel said coldly. One of them sneered. "Step aside, soldier. The kingdom has no future with her alive." Daniel raised his sword. "You will not touch her." The men drew their blades and the clash of steel rang out in the quiet palace. Daniel fought with all his strength, blocking and striking with skill born from years of war. The traitors pressed hard, but Daniel's heart burned with purpose. He was not fighting for himself. He was fighting for his queen. The battle was fierce. Sparks flew as swords met. Daniel's arm ached, and blood ran from a cut on his shoulder, but he refused to fall. With each strike, he pushed them back. At last, 2 of the men lay wounded on the ground, and the others fled into the shadows. Daniel stood, breathing hard, his sword dripping with sweat and blood. Clara rushed out of the chamber, her eyes wide with fear. "Daniel, are you hurt?" He shook his head, though pain ran through his body. "It is nothing. The queen is safe. That is all that matters." But he knew the danger was far from over. The traitors had grown bold. They would not stop until they claimed the throne. The kingdom was on the edge of war, and the palace itself had become the first battlefield. Next day, flames rose in the city. Loyal soldiers clashed with those who had turned to the traitors. Streets filled with shouting and fear. The people did not know who to trust, and chaos spread quickly. Daniel led a group of faithful guards through the smoke-filled air, protecting the roads to the palace. His sword was never still, and his voice carried strength to those who followed him. Inside the palace, Queen Eleanor grew weaker, her life hanging by a thread. Clara held her hand, refusing to let go. She whispered to the queen that help was near, that Daniel still fought for her, that hope was not lost. Daniel returned to the chamber after hours of battle. His armor was broken in places, his face marked with dirt and blood, but when he saw the queen still breathing, his heart lifted. He knelt by her bed and spoke softly, "Hold on, my queen. The kingdom still needs you. I will not let them take you." She opened her eyes faintly, her gaze weak, but clear enough to see him. For a moment she smiled, a small, fragile smile that gave him strength greater than any weapon. That night the palace stood surrounded by enemies. Fires burned outside the walls, and the sound of battle carried through the air. Daniel stood at the gates with his sword ready, knowing the fight was not finished. The traitors would come again, stronger and more desperate. But he also knew this truth. As long as he lived, they would not pass. He was one man against many, but his spirit was unbroken. For his queen, he would fight until his last breath. The night was long and full of fire. The sound of battle shook the palace walls, and smoke from burning streets drifted through the air. Daniel stood at the main gate with his sword in his hand, his armor cracked and his body tired, but his spirit strong. Around him a handful of loyal soldiers held their ground. They knew the traitors were many, but they stood because they believed in their queen and in the fighter who led them. The enemy came in waves, shouting as they charged, blades flashing in the light of the flames. Daniel fought with all the strength left in him. His arms were heavy, but every strike found its mark. He cut through the crowd, blocking, pushing, and striking with a heart full of fire. Each time he felt close to falling, he thought of Queen Eleanor lying weak in her chamber. That thought gave him the strength to rise again. Clara watched from a window above, her heart trembling with fear and hope. She saw Daniel fighting as if he carried the kingdom on his shoulders. She turned back to the queen and held her hand. "You will not let them win," she whispered softly. "You must live, my queen. He fights for you. We all fight for you." Inside the palace, the traitors tried once more to break through. They spread through halls and stairways, their footsteps loud and sharp. But Daniel's men met them at every corner, swords clashing, shields breaking. The palace became a storm of steel, and Daniel moved through it like a flame that refused to die. At last, Daniel faced the leader of the traitors, a man dressed in rich robes with a sword in his hand. His eyes were cold and full of greed. He looked at Daniel with anger. "You fight for a dying queen," the man said. "Step aside, and I will spare your life." Daniel raised his sword, his voice firm. "I fight for more than a queen. I fight for every man and woman who still believes in her. I fight for the soul of this kingdom." Their swords met with a crash that echoed through the hall. The fight was fierce. The traitor was skilled, but Daniel's will was stronger. Pain shot through his body with every move, but he refused to fall. With one final strike, Daniel drove his sword forward, and the traitor collapsed to the ground. The remaining enemies, seeing their leader fall, lost their courage and fled into the night. Silence fell at last. The fire still burned outside, but the palace was safe. Daniel leaned against the wall, his chest rising and falling, his body trembling from exhaustion. Blood ran from his wounds, yet he stood tall, his eyes fixed on the queen's chamber. He made his way slowly to her room. Clara opened the door, her face pale but filled with relief. She stepped aside as Daniel entered. Queen Eleanor lay weak, but her eyes opened when she saw him. For a moment she looked at him as if he was the only thing in the world. "You are safe," she whispered, her voice faint but steady. Daniel knelt beside her bed. "The kingdom is safe, my queen. The traitors are gone. You must rest now. Your people need you." Her hand moved slowly, resting on his arm. "It was you who saved them. You gave them hope when hope was lost." Tears touched Daniel's eyes, though he bowed his head to hide them. "I only did what I had to do." Clara smiled softly, watching them both. She knew the truth. Daniel had given more than anyone else could. He had given his strength, his courage, and his life's blood to keep the queen alive. His name would be remembered long after this night ended. The days that followed were hard, but the kingdom began to heal. The fires were put out, the streets cleared, and the people learned the truth of what had happened. They spoke Daniel's name with honor, calling him the fighter who risked everything for his queen. Though his body carried scars, his spirit stood unbroken. Queen Eleanor lived, her strength slowly returning, and she ruled with even greater wisdom than before. By her side was Clara, faithful and kind. And standing watch nearby, though always in the shadows, was Daniel, the fighter whose loyalty had saved them all. The kingdom did not forget the night when all seemed lost. They remembered how one man had stood against many, refusing to give in. They remembered how a queen on the verge of death had been given life again through courage and sacrifice. And they remembered that hope was never truly gone, as long as there was someone willing to risk everything for it.